观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到今天的思想先驱报节目现场啊！我现在呢是忍不住在笑，为什么呢？这个何明先生啊，之前呢是进行了一个体检，被医生告知啊要少吃糖、少吃油脂啊，注意血脂和血糖。何明先生还在办公室向我们全体同志立下重誓啊，以后我中午只吃萝卜和黄瓜，还有芹菜啊，把自己好像搞得像一个要进化成兔子了。结果刚才啊，何明先生啊，这个一脸恐慌的进到了演播室。手里好像拿着什么东西，不敢给我们看啊。我们说到底拿了什么？一看何明先生从同事上周送给整个办公室同事的月饼中拿了一大块，自己开始月饼，然后说不行，忍不住了一定要吃一吃。有的时候我们嘴上说的和心里想的其实完全不一样。那么有的时候呢，我们在对于一个国家的经济状况进行评价的时候所看到的表象和实质也有很多的不同。我们对于中国经济的印象，以及我们亲身的观察，还有中国经济的底层数据，对于现在的经济运行形势所展现的情景，可能也有细微的差距。但是，到底哪一种情况才是更加准确的？是直观的感受更加具有个人的经验性，是片面的，还是只有直观的感受才是最真实的？因为数据有很多的水分，这一些问题都是我们今天可以讨论的焦点。之前在华尔街论坛节目中我们也向大家介绍 Arthur Kruger 这个是 Gavekal 的一位著名的中国经济分析者和研究师，曾经和我们是媒体同行，但是后来呢自己办了咨询公司他近期受哈佛大学的邀请，在哈佛大学进行了一个有关于中国经济的讲座。他所讲的其实就是我们刚才由一个月饼引出的话茬，看到的与心里想的与实际的情况中间可能会出现的问题。那我们说在刚刚过去的这几个月里大家听到了很多有关于中国经济前景暗淡的说法，还有一些说法说中国已经黄金时刻过去，有一些说法说中国长期将停滞，也有说法说中国最近已经出现了经济衰退，甚至有可能会重回90年代日本式的资产负债表式的衰退。中国的经济可能已经出现了系统性的深层次的问题，中国的增长和全球的影响力都将就此覆灭。是不是真的这样呢？是不是他们所看到的数据可以用来支持总体论述呢？的确，从某一些情况下而看这一些基本的焦虑是真实的，也是重要的，反映了很多民众情绪现在对于未来中国经济发展不确定性而产生的一种悲观。何明先生一直还在嚼东西我们观众朋友们可能都已经听到了，这是一个月饼吃了好几遍但是呢，这个 Arthur Kruger 先生在这个讲座中他就讲说有关于这一些论述我们也要仔细看哪一些论述在数据层面是得到支持的，哪一些层面其实更多的可能是几个月的暂时现象，假以时日，中国经济可能会呈现更加本源的本质。有关于中国经济，外界主要有几种观点比较流行。首先呢是债务说中国经济增长过去的主要动力就是基础设施和房地产的投资，而这一些投资呢往往是债务融资，与我们在美国的股权融资有很大的不同。现在债务这个窟窿是越来越大了，中国很有可能面临一场上个世纪90年代初日本式的金融危机，对于整个房地产市场的泡沫进行一次清算，而清算之后不仅仅是失落30年，失落20年，可能是失落50年，甚至中国就永远失落了。这个呢是一种比较流行的对于中国经济形势的分析说法。第二个分析说法是什么呢？就是所谓的信心危机，或者呢叫做中国真正的危机是信心的缺失，是对于国家命运前途的暗淡化。那么这样的一个说法是不是有道理呢？的确，如果到中国去问一问现在中国普遍的消费者，问一问中国的私营企业家，那么的确他们认为现在中国是出现了很多意识形态和政治越权的现象，有的时候让人觉得压得透不过来气。过去几十年里，大家始终感觉不管中国有多少的问题，方向始终是越来越好的，始终是越来越自由的。现在大家对于国家的发展方向越来越看不清楚了。也有人把这个政治上的抑郁或者是政治上的信心缺失归咎于是一系列混乱政策的结果。那么这一种观点认为呢， 经济下滑是多种因素共同的结果，比如大流行病期间呢，整个这个清零政策可以说是荒唐至极，出口减少，再限制外商，再加上现在整个国际地缘政治的外部压力，被认为是整个中国的政策出现了混乱，再叠加地缘政治的紧张局势，导致中国经济被一脚踢入了一个死循环的陷阱中。也有一些观点认为中国经济呢其实也有拯救之道。拯救之道是什么呢？就是必须让消费成为经济发展的主导。因为现在中国的经济发展的确是存在很严重的失衡，投资这一边呢其实呢已经利好吃尽了。英文里面有一个说法叫低垂的果实叫比较容易摘的这一些果实已经在几十年前被吃尽了，现在进行结构化改革，只有向消费者和民间分福利，这样才能够让整个经济发展走向更加平衡的轨道。那么这一种观点呢，之前我们在节目中也介绍到也是很多经济学家所持的严肃的观点。但是Arthur Kruber 就认为这几种观点当然正确性与这个荒谬性是各自的比重是不太一样的，但是普遍都有一个问题，就是每一种观点都抓住了中国复杂现实的一部分，但是又不是全面的一部分。这样的观点呢，你要是从这个找到论据的角度，都能够从经济现实中找到一些论据。但是如果你认为这样的每一种观点，或者是其中的一种观点，就概括了中国经济的全部现实，那么可能你把中国这个系统想的也太过简单化了。我们首先举个例子来说20世纪90年代的日本，中国的情况与20世纪90年代的日本是不是有很多相似点？表面上来看，的确是的。巨大的资产价格的泡沫，遭遇国际地缘政治逆风，特别是来自美国的挤兑和打压。同时呢，整个国内的这个债务水平也达到了某一种不可持续的状态。在全球化的过程中，全球化再分工又让之前中国或者是日本的成本优势有所下降，被周边其他更富成本和人力优势的国家可能会取代，等等等等，的确是有很多的相似点。但是我们看到细微的差别也是十分需要我们注意的。日本的这个巨大的资产价格泡沫，实际上是相互关联的企业和银行金融体系，以及作为抵押品的土地价值所共同撑起来的。简而言之，各个部门之间相互抵押、相互借贷、互压杠杆，导致整个经济成为了一张大网的一部分。这就导致了一个经济危机传染性的特点。只要有经济中的一个部门，比如说日本的房地产部门出现了危机，出现了还款压力，出现了债务的不可承担性，那么就会直接传导到银行系统，再由银行系统传导到实体企业，再从实体企业传导到个人储户，一下子就形成了整个经济的我们叫做恐慌性的这样的一次传染性的金融危机。中国房地产市场的债务问题，绝对数字而言当然是非常严重的，但是我们也要注意到中国的体制和日本体制的不一样。中国的金融系统和企业系统之间这种相互勾连、互压杠杆的现象是比较少的。那么在企业方面，其实中国的企业去杠杆不是最近才开始的，已经至少有10几年的时间了。整个中国企业的负债率其实是相对良性的。当然中国的这个国企是有很大的隐形债务问题，特别是非上市的企业。但是中国经济真正的命脉支柱，并不像外界所想象的那样的债台高筑。因此Arthur Kruber 就提出了一个观点，对于中国经济，你不能光看表面性的一些类比上的相似性，你要看到中国经济这个系统到底是怎么运行的。光去按照日本的名词、美国的名词、金融危机的名词去套，很有可能与中国实际的落差是比较大的。我们说这个历史不是总是惊人的相似，但是历史又总有余音绕梁。余音绕梁到底有多大的情况上能够反映两个经济的相似情况，我觉得我们还要具体问题具体分析。而说到中国的债务问题，中国的债务问题和日本和美国相比有一个什么特点呢？它并不是在各个经济部门、各个经济角落都是千篇一律是一致的。中国的这个经济有一个什么特点呢？就是几个孤岛，严重的地方特别严重， 但是整个经济的基本面而言，又没有普遍性的债务问题。这个说法我们怎么说啊？这个中国的整体的中央政府的债务其实是相对健康的，这一点我们在之前的节目中已经为大家介绍了。另外呢，中国家庭储户的整个负债状况也是相对良性的。那这一点呢，如果和比如说，如果大家生活在西方，特别是生活在美国的话，可能感受十分的真切。整个中国家庭的我们叫做这个储蓄积蓄以及整个的这个债务的状况仍然是比较可持续的。刚才我们为大家介绍，中国企业经过几十年的去杠杆，实际上的债务水平也是可持续的。那这个债务真正的问题在哪儿呢？其实是在某一些地方政府、房地产企业以及一些农村的信用和商业银行。这样的这些地方，当然问题是非常的严重的，也是不可持续的。但是反过来讲，这一些特定领域的巨额债务对于整个宏观经济不是横向的一波杀到底的这样的一种影响，也不是给整个经济蒙上了一层阴影。这实际上是中国解决债务问题一个最好的护城河。有的地方问题非常严重，但是可以定点破弹内爆的方式来解决。而对于整个经济根本性、传染性的危机，实际上的可能性是比较低的。这就是我们说中国经济日本化失去30年、50年这一种说法站不住脚的一个地方。另外更让大家觉得有真实性的一个说法，就是中国公众对于中国政府的信心正在减弱。之前我们在节目中也为大家谈到信心的危机，而 Arthur Cooper 也介绍到他非常理解这一种直观的感受。那么去年他在中国待了1个多月，当时许多的私营企业家就跟他说现在对于消费需求的疲软非常的担忧，需求一担忧，他们在投资在招聘方面非常的犹豫不决，大家对于前景也不看好，的确是比较暗淡。而在 Arthur Cooper 和企业家的交谈中，他也发现很多中国的私营企业家现在对于党是充满了不信任、敌意，甚至是恐惧。大家对于习近平的反感情绪也非常的严重，认为无处不在的控制和政治化、意识形态化对于中国经济家、对于中国企业家的发展和创造是非常的不利的。民间看来更是对于这个高度高压政治的不满，对于言论空间的收紧有很多的不满和怨恨。对于国家的命运和前途，有很多人现在谈起来也是一声长叹。但是 Arthur Cooper 在这一个演讲中就介绍了另外一面，就是说这些坊间的传闻，这一些直观的感受，的确是反映了大家的某一种真实的心态。但是数据或许可以给我们提供一个不太一样的视角。在 Arthur Cooper 看来，如果我们看到消费数据的情况，其实展示的并不是大家对于未来失去了信心。消费者现在之所以出现复苏低迷，不是因为缺乏信心而拒绝消费，觉得这个国家要完蛋了，所以我不去花钱了，而是大流行这几年导致他们的可支配收入的确是减少了。3年的连续封锁，再加上失业这一些因素，都是造成这种情况的原因。另外，过去几年经济搞成这个样子，未来前景不明确，大家在消费上更加的谨慎。在整个疫情之后，整个全世界的旅行还没有完全恢复的时候，出境旅行和出境消费有所收缩，也是正常的一个现象。而更重要的是什么呢？整个中国政府在大流行病期间没有给消费者提供消费性的支持，更导致大家的可支配性收入出现了季节性的下跌。这与美国的经济刺激计划、提高家庭收入、补贴家庭的这一种经济哲学是有根本性的不同的。因此Arthur Cooper 又做了一个判断，真正的问题不是信心的问题，其实根本还是一个疫情之后可支付能力，或者我们叫做可支配收入水平没有完全恢复的一个暂时性的这样的一个谷底。那么判断 Arthur Cooper 的这个判断是不是正确，也有一个很好的标杆，就是我们看到可支配的收入水平是不是恢复了。如果恢复到疫情前的水平，消费是不是会有所回暖？而从实际数据上来看，也的确是证实了 Arthur Cooper 的这个说法。现在我们看到近期的数据显示，居民的可支配收入水平 基本恢复到疫情发生前的水平。那我们也知道，消费数据一般比这个收入数据是滞后几个月的，而就在收入恢复到疫情前水平的几个月后，在上个月我们看到消费也出现了很大的回暖的趋势。因此Arthur Kruber 就判断这一种暂时的看上去好像是对于国家前途命运失去信心出现了悲观意识这样的一个情绪是真实的，但是它本质上不是消费者信心的丧失，还是可支配收入的暂时的减少。而如果我们说到私营企业家对于未来的消费的对于未来的信心完全缺失，就正好与数据是背道而驰了。如果私营企业家对于国家前途完全失去了信心，那么我们看到的应该是私营部门的投资越来越少。你对于国家前途都没有信心了，你干嘛还要进行投资呢？但是实际上，现在数据显示，私营部门对于制造业的投资仍然是非常强劲的。当然，这看到具体的行业，有一些行业的确是受到疫情的打击，困境是比较明显的，房地产包括电子商务包括一些服务业、教育业等等等等。但是现在在政府重点扶持的一些产业，私人投资实际上是蓬勃发展的，比如电动车，比如新能源，比如高端制造业，再比如现在的芯片产业等等等等。从整体上来看，私营投资实际上是不降反升的状态。那么大家钱还是在往中国投，只不过现在是投到知道政府支持的这一些重点的标杆行业。从这个情况来看你可以说中国经济正在进行结构性的转折，但你要完全说私营企业家已经对于国家未来失去了希望，那这个说法呢，其实也有不那么合适，或者说不那么全面的地方。因此Arthur Kruber 就提出了，说中国经济到底是不是出现了内乱呢？是不是已经到了危机关口了？还是在某一个大挫折的时候进行结构性的转折？有一些行业的确是垮台了，另外一些行业正在创新前进。真实的现实可能是复杂而且是多面的。那么到底应该怎样更准确地描述中国经济运行的现实呢？ Arthur Kruber 在这个演讲中就提出了一个不同的一个视角。他就说说的确过去40年，中国把经济增长理解成就是单一的一个数字 ，GDP 越快越好，对不对只要 GDP 增8、增10、增12，那我们的经济运行状况就一切良好。但是在现在这几年，由于整个经济态势的转变，由于中国底层经济运行发生了结构性的变化，中国对于什么是经济增长优质的评估已经出现了变化。现在大家更强调的是，比如说安全社会公平技术自给自足等等等等。所谓的经济增长的速度已经不再是对于经济发展好不好的一个评价了。中央政府现在更重要看到的是技术实力，是不是有应对外部挑战的能力，是不是有经济的内功等等等等。对于中国经济的评价标准，在高层思路中其实已经出现了一个根本性的调整。我们再来看到最近所谓的这个中国经济发展出现了方向性的变化，在 Arthur Kruber 看来，并不是什么国进民退，也不是什么从经济发展是第一要务转成是政治当先、意识形态优先了，而是用经济术语说，正在进行新一轮的优质资本的重新配置。中央政府也意识到，过去这种基础设施和房地产对于整个经济的带动龙头效应不可能长久下去。现在对于资本的重新分配，是政府牵着优先把优势资本和我们叫做集中性的能源，考虑在技术进步、将经济转向更生产率高的领域进行投资。说白了，仍然是以经济发展为中心，只不过现在的中心的核心和过去大家理解的经济发展的要义已经出现了变化。当然了，有经济学家可能会认为，这个经济发展的结构性转型，到底哪一些行业是应该培植的，应该由市场化来决定，应该有一个自然的优胜劣汰的这样的一个效应。光是你习近平一拍脑袋想电车咱们得做电车咱们得做芯片，那你很有可能是导致资源的我们叫做错配，或者是优质资源的浪费。但是对于中国的问题而言，从经济的角度而言由一个领域的优势资源转移到另外一个领域，由一个领域的投资转向另外一个我们叫做 叫做重点或者叫做优势领域的投资，并不是从市场化向非市场化的一个过渡，而是在同样一个市场化的过程中出现了优先事项的调配。再来说到债务问题，债务的确是对于中国很大的一个约束，也是现在必须要小心又小心解决的一个老大难的问题。但是在 Arthur Kruber 看来，中国的债务问题并不是中国经济崩溃的导火索，更合理的或者说是更准确的一个说法是，它对于现在的政策起到了很大的制约作用，是给习近平戴上的手铐。为什么这么说呢？如果中国现在没有地方政府的债务问题，那中国可能经济复苏可以更快，因为中国的刺激措施可以用得更猛一些下药下得更猛，人恢复得更快。那么大家不用经历3年的恢复，不用经历非常不平衡的恢复，可能一步到位，这个痛苦更短期一些。现在由于有这样的债务问题，不能再把债务的泡沫吹大了，那么对于中央政府的政策的确是一些制约。国企和地方政府背负着大量的债务，房地产市场土地出售现在又面临着政策性的调整，解决这些问题是一项多年的挑战。如果没有这一些问题，可能这一次恢复的就要更加平顺一些，有了问题恢复就更加曲折和波折一些。因此我们看到全面理解中国经济的轨迹我们的这个视角不仅仅要更加的多元，同时也要更加的细致。再来说到过去大家对于中国经济发展或者叫做中国政治进步，往往呢有一个理解，就是说政治进步就是自由化，政治进步就是更多的民主化，更多的产权保障。只有这样，大家才对国家发展的大方向更能够充满信心，投资以及创新的动力才更多。从某一些方向而言的确有道理。那么我们说，基本的制度保障和法律保障在哪个国家都是经济发展的一个基本性的这样的一个环境的转变。但是中国现在出现的意识形态的倒退与经济之间出现增长，或者是经济之间出现衰退，到底是不是一个必然的因果关系？这一点呢，在 Arthur Kruber 看，我们也需要分项来看。对于习近平而言，在 Arthur Kruber 看来，他实际上呢，对于整个国家科技以及经济进步的理解，与我们很多更向往西式，特别是美国式的自由化、民主化、良性商业环境和个人化的创新环境的拥趸者看来，实际上是出现了方向性的不同。在中央政府来看，美国式的以消费为核心的这一种发展呢，其实根基并不稳健，可能会导致一次又一次的金融危机，导致整个产业的中空化。在这个 Arthur Kruber 看来，现在习近平为中国经济的成功定义的一个新的一个方向，其实更多的是一种列宁主义的德国化的模式。什么叫列宁主义的德国化的模式呢？我们先说德国化。德国化，制造业强国，强大的出口能力，强大的贸易能力，强大的创新能力，强大的产业集群，以及强大的工业能力，特别是突破高新技术难关的这样的一个产业生态，这可能是中国现在所追求的。而在有一些行业的确是取得了一些成功，比如我们刚才提到的电车和新能源。什么叫做列宁主义式的德国化呢？就是说在选择哪一些工业集群，哪一些先进制程能力的时候，这个过程不是由市场化来完成的，而是有国家自己的优先事项，有国家自己基于地缘政治、基于安全、基于先进优势、基于先进事项的考虑。比如现在芯片是卡脖子的，现在芯片是最有可能对于中国发展进行掣肘的这一个环节，那芯片就是我们的优先事项。所以是一种国家意识形态加上地缘政治考虑，加上政权安全考虑，再加上对于底层先进制造业实力以及形成工业生态和自给自足需求这样一个比较复杂的动力以及这样的一个体系性的关系。那么这一点，列宁式的德国模式到底是原教旨的共产主义还是自由资本主义？其实可能都不是，它是一个更加复杂的一个经济优先事项。关于列宁主义式的德国模式能不能走成，现在中国发展经济的方式是不是正确的，我们当然可以提出很多的异议。但是片面的说中国经济要重回50、60年代大锅饭，重回共产主义，或者说中国经济只有自由主义美式式的繁荣和金融化 才是未来的必由之道。只有以消费和服务业带动的经济才是平衡的经济，恐怕也是对于中国经济现在的发展水平一个过于片面化的理解。在这一篇演讲的后半部分呢 ，Arthur Gruber 也谈及了现在中国经济面临的一些优势，面临的一些挑战。他在优势方面特别谈到的是一个中国制造生态系统的实力。这一种实力，这种制造生态一旦形成，就让其他国家很难复制。而在中国面临的挑战的时候，他特别提及的是中国的一些私营企业家如果办得过大，是不是会被视为是潜在的政治威胁？随着时间的推移，创新性的社会在这样的一个政治环境中可能很难真的达到蓬勃发展。而我们说这个领导人犯错误是经常的事情，对于形势的判断出现问题也是会发生的事情。如果现在领导人一拍脑袋做出了错误的决策，那么还可以有挽救的空间像之前3年疫情封锁。那如果对于中国的经济发展做出了一个彻底失误的决策，让国家误入歧途，与地缘政治方面在铤而走险，导致更大的矛盾，让中国的经济彻底陷入了一个我们叫做这个曲径，或者是陷入了一个死循环中，这些都是现实的可能。但是不管怎么样，中国经济的复杂就如中国本身的庞大和复杂一样。未来中国经济10年的增长率当然不可能冲回8%、10%，更有可能是3%和3.5%。但是轻易说中国无法技术进步，中国的技术进步完全是偷抢骗来的。习近平时代中国经济要重回意识形态高地，专制主义就不会产生工业发展，专制主义就不能导致经济的发展以及产业的创新，恐怕也是过分简单化了。到底中国的经济会发展成什么样，也只有时间才能够告诉我们答案。那我刚才是一口气把这个 Arthur Gruber 先生的这个观点介绍完了，下面呢我们就请和平先生来评点一下他说的哪一些观点是有道理的，哪一些观点是我们还可以继续讨论的。
抱歉了，这个节目
等您老人家月饼吃完也消化一下
对
现在是可以。现在是不是已经开始这个血糖反应上来了，已经昏昏欲睡了？
对，我们的这个导播还没有等我吃完就把镜头切过来了。哎呦，这个我跟他打手势半天，赶紧把我拉下去。很抱歉了，就是因为我们的这个节目有时候就是跟战场也差不多所以有人把这个编辑部当成这个战情室也是蛮有道理的。实际上我们每个人同事都差不多，像我们小杨像这个李琦其实基本上都是，还有我们新红基本上都是在办公桌上吃东西所以但是呢这个样子实在是很糟糕，我这一次的表示的这个道歉。但是这篇文章上个星期李琦不是就介绍给我了然后呢我们的这个也做成了一个完整的视频放在华尔街电视。后来我也推荐给一些朋友看，我是没有看，但是我先推荐给朋友看。那么杨天先生看了以后，在周六8点的时候跟大家就做了一些介绍，那么后来大家也做了一些讨论。不过我刚才听李琦博士讲有几个点因为点很多那么其中最关键的一个点在这后面就呈现出来，中国的这个制造业建立的不是某一个制造业那么单一的一个成果，也不是说电动汽车现在很厉害就是电动汽车，而是中国形成了一套制造业的生态体系。而这种体系如果你看中国本身来讲，你可以说缺失很多，但是如果你去跟全球或者周边可以转移制造业能力的国家相比，你发现这个复制的能力我不能说永远不可以，但是我是在同样的条件之下，大概是20-30年，我们之前也讲过这一点。而这个生态体系就像我们要做媒体我们做媒体一直在追求办一个杂志，办一个报纸，办一个平台办一个什么什么东西是找到一个非常优秀的主持人或者是一个很好的这个作家 其实我在过去几十年中间我就已经早就打消了这种念头，因为我认为任何一个主播他可能都有休息的时间，任何一个优秀的媒体人他可能都有一些观念上的变化，或者是观众喜不喜欢。但是如果建立了一个生态体系，它就不一样它有自我循环、自我修复、自我改变的这个能力。而在我看起来中国走德国式的这种道路，如果大家还记得的话，在4、5年或者3、4年以前的想点就点我就讲过，中国不可能走美式的道路，因为美国的这个条件是中国所不具有的。如果要学习美国，一很难学，第二学了以后非常的危险，所以呢，中国更倾向于走这个德国式的这个路线。但是呢，德国式的路线它的局限性也是存在的一些问题，实际上它是进行了某些修整和调整。然后在中国的经济的改革开放过程中间，我们的中国的朋友对这个计划经济、对党的对经济的控制伤害、对国家的力量可以来自于社会主义国家的人，基本上都是持反对、厌恶和排斥的态度，忽视了资本主义在现代化的过程中间，尤其是现代的国家，基本上如果没有国家力量的驱动，这个国家在基本上的工业、基本上的体系、基本上的产业是很难形成的。甚至可以说，如果没有必要的这个基础，你哪怕有再聪明的发明家，再这个有条理的管理者，或者是很勤奋的这个工人，你都未必能够形成一个产业的这个体系。西方现在出现的问题，恰恰是在这方面是出现了某一种萎缩或者衰退，或者是叫停止。我们不能讲太多的萎缩讲了太多的萎缩的话，有人就可能会觉得跟中共的某一些认定是有关系这还不能这么说。我们只能说出现了某一种停止。但是在中国的经济发展模式中间，它恰恰是糅合了他认为的对他有利的，或者是这种形成生态体系的这种要点。那么今天其实已经形成了，形成之后，那么至于是什么产品，至于是什么产业，其实都是可以调整和改变的。在我看起来，中国在新的一个技术的这样一个转型阶段，很有可能它的新型技术和它的产业的生态会形成某一种结合。所以在乐观的看法现在还没有出现。什么叫没有出现呢？是因为根本没人敢讲。因为大家现在都说中国经济完蛋了，要么就是南美陷阱，要么就是日本衰落，要么就是这个怎么样，对吧？甚至还有人说回到文革时期，回到50年代，还有人说中国下一步就是东朝鲜了。所以你在这种情况之下说没有那么悲观，就已经很不容易了所以这样一位学者呢，他所提出的东西呢，在我看起来是比较中性的，他胆子很小，对吧？还可能说未来的经济不可能出现高增长。
没有是10%以上的增长时代
是不会出现高增长嘛，就是大概是3%、4%就可以了嘛。它是这样一个比较谨慎嘛。其实在我看起来，中国的经济的这个生态它有3种前头的估计。第一个是最乐观的不能再乐观了，就是说中国完全主导新技术制造业的一个成功，中国会实现第2次的全球经济的引擎的作用，而且是主导性的作用。我说就是现在没人敢这么说，所以我们也只能暂且不表。那么这位学者他是属于比较中间判的中性判制，他承认中国的经济是存在很多的问题，很多事实不是说不是事实，但是他提出了一个观点还是引起我特别的注意，他就提出了一个信心的问题。他认为这个信心呢，不是对这个政府或者是对未来的前途失去信心，是你的收入的缺失所造成的。这个东西我真需要花一点时间来消化，因为我们现在的这个民众，我接触很多，真正对今天的政府、对习近平，或者是对中国的前途有很大的信心的人，只会是那些另外一些极端的人士，或者是一般的老百姓，他就凭直观，根据他的生活的体力，过着很糟糕，现在就很好了。对吧？有一些农民，或者是有一些工人，或者是有一些社会民众那个是他直接的这个感受。但是你真精英阶层、企业家或者是学者，你是很难看到一个比较有信心的这样一个表述。而他呢，就把它归结于只是一个呢，就是说 一个收入的一个缺失的一个暂时的现象，而且呢，这个现在的一个正在恢复之中这个是对我来讲是需要一个思考点。但他讲的最关键的第一点就是说，中国是把增长我不要了，我不要 GDP 了我发展不重要了，国家安全第一，对吧？安全压倒一切稳定压倒一切，是不是这样？不是的，他提出的实际上是中国是一个增长走向了另外一个增长，就是以新技术来驱动或者是这种形成国家的实力。但是这种国家的实力，它需要建立一个前提，这种前提就是国家安全。国家安全是两方面的，一个安全呢是来自于西方的这种围堵，或者是意识形态，或者是颜色革命，或者是民主自由的价值观对中国人的这种号召和影响力那么另一方面呢就是来自于内在的这个质疑。现在很多人过去发展的很好，现在不行了，他当然是有很多怨恨。那过去帮助你一起闹革命、搞改革开放取得成就了，我今天现在变成贪官。那么原来我觉得我毕业以后可以找到很好的工作，现在有一点像当年的知青回到城里面，他要突然发现，毛主席叫我们上山下乡，结果你上山下乡不搞了，我回到城里面什么工作都没有。现在你是号召我读大学，号召我学习知识，我学了知识以后，我工作都找不到。所以很多的层次叠加在一起，再加上疫情，再加上原来产业结构的调整，现在的怨恨是使中国出现某一种危险的阶段。这种危险的阶段，它要么缩导，对吧？要么呢就是强硬的这个打压，现在是比较趋向于强硬。那么这些东西我们公开讲起来，确实是有它的为难的地方，因为它确实缺乏道德的力量，确实缺乏一些法律的基础，更不符合现在的这个价值观。但是我们又看看全球各地的发展的模式来看，虽然我们能够看到的样本很少，但是这些样本已经告诉我们，民主和自由在80年代、90年代确实有巨大的感召力。但是民主和自由，颜色革命也好，政变也好，苏东坡也好，给这些国家所带来的那种冲击，比原来想象的要大很多。法律的秩序、经济的发展、政治的这种真正理性的这种辩论，或者是这个权力的这种分解和制约，其实并不是那么建立起来。虽然中国已经有一部分意识到这个问题，需要稳妥的前进，但是很多人的怨气，很多人的失望，它也是一个真实的感受。什么叫事实？他认为他看到的就是坚强的事实。那么什么是数据？他认为经过他的经验所看到的数据，它就是真实的这个数据。其实无论是事实和数据，都需要经过更多专业化的、技术化的这个理解去了解或者是分解。但是政治的神秘性和复杂性，就是说没有人听你这么进行一个理性的分析，更多的是基于这种直观的，或者是形成的，或者互相群体影响的这么一种信息系统。所以中国的现在的这种混乱或者是出现的某种危机，确确实实是比较严重的。你疏导是不是像洪水一样的爆发如果你堵塞你是不是这种会把你这个堤坝进行这个冲垮？中国是出现这种危机。如果中国在未来几个月之内经济的数据仍然是下滑，仍然是很糟糕，原来情况可能没有那么严重，可能由于这个数据的出现，从来的增加更大的这个稳定的难度。如果是中国未来几个月数字大体上还是比较稳定的，也许中国这个难关就比大家想象的危险度过了。所以我们在这个时候听到的这个声音呢，其实都是重复。我每天看这个简报，我就看西方媒体关于中国的报道和分析可以说90%以上，或者是更大的比例就是重复的是老调。在这个时候，如果有一位学者或者是有一些媒体人能够跟我们呈现一些我们没有看到的一些角度和事实，这就是非常难能可贵的。这就是我们不断的跟大家提供一些呢，就是说跟你平常看的不一样，可能跟你平常想的不一样的一个重要的价值。所以非常感谢李杰博士，
谢谢何明先生感谢金山给我们打赏。在今天节目的最后呢，我们要为大家完整呈现的就是今天着重为大家介绍的 Arthur Cooper 先生 在哈佛大学这个讲座啊，这个讲座末尾呢，还有他现场回答哈佛大学的研究学者、学生以及教师提问的相关环节，也十分的有启发。谢谢大家。同时啊，也要向大家介绍很多有些智库啊、学者的演讲啊，包括美国的一些官员啊进行的最新的政策表态，我们都会在华尔街电视的华尔街智库栏目中为大家提供原汁原味的材料。如果您想了解到现在世界思想界、学界对于中国的最新评论，对于中国的最新研究，行业对于中国发展评估的动态，请一定不要错过华尔街电视的华尔街智库栏目。好了，以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部内容，谢谢大家对于本节目的支持。下周三同一时间我们再会。
I guess the starting point is, this is basically what we were reading this summer, that not only was China going through a bad economic patch, but that this was symbolic of deep underlying problems that implicate China's ability to keep growing and keep exerting influence in the world for years and decades to come. And if you want to be a little bit flippant about this, it's like basically we had 3 months or 4 months of bad economic data, and then people came out of the woodwork trying to establish that these 3 or 4 months of data justified grand narratives and stories that they've been telling for years and decades. And kind of this was their moment to say that, yes, we have now been proven correct in all of these critiques that we've had of the underlying structures of the Chinese economy. And to be frank, I think a lot of these arguments were trying to make a very small number of data points do an awful lot of work, right? There was a lot of grand narratives being to a fairly small evidentiary basis. But I think it is fair to say that, concerns about the sustainability of Chinese growth have been rising a number of years. Concerns about the ability of China to continue balancing between an authoritarian political system and a capitalist economic system have grown a lot as the political system has become much more authoritarian and much more personalized under Xi Jinping. So while I think a lot of the hyperventilating over the last few months was frankly not all that constructive, I do think that the underlying questions that people are anxious about are real and they're very serious. And so I think the question is to figure out, just what's the exact nature of these problems? What's the nature of the risks that are building up in China? And how close are we to some kind of major inflection point in the trajectory of Chinese growth? So just to summarize, in any speech like this has to have its straw man. So here I have my straw man that I have put together sort of my interpretations of other people's arguments. But broadly speaking, I think you can report 3 major descriptions of Chinese economic troubles this year. The first 2 are saying what we're seeing now is symptoms of these deep structural malaises, and so there's big problems. And the first one of these is what you could call the debt trap problem. There are different variants of this, but the basic idea is that for the last 15 years, China's growth has depended very heavily on investments in infrastructure and property. A lot of this was financed by debt. A lot of this debt is not repayable or is having difficulty being repaid now. And so China has built up this kind of unsustainable debt pyramid. And now the bill has come due and China is basically stuck in a situation very similar to the situation of Japan in the early 1990s. And in fact, Richard Koo, the economist who came up with the description of the Japanese problems in the 1990s of a balance sheet recession, came out and he was asked, is China in a balance sheet recession? And he said, yes. So there is a school of thought that says basically what we're seeing here is the inevitable secular slowdown of China's growth trajectory because of the buildup of unsustainable debt. Second, even broader argument is one that was advanced most lucidly by Adam Posen in Foreign Affairs recently. And his argument is essentially the fact that consumers and entrepreneurs did not respond to the end of COVID restrictions in China by shooting the lights out and just booming back into revenge spending and revenge investment and dynamic growth. This proves that consumers and private entrepreneurs have lost confidence in the fundamental Chinese system. And so we now have the victory of Leninist political structures over the dynamic economy. And so China is now, again, stuck in a much, much lower growth trajectory because of the failure to come to a good reconciliation of its political and economic systems. Then there's another explanation, which is a little bit more, it's a little bit more contingent, I guess you could say, or it's not so much of a grand narrative, it's a little bit more empirical. And basically it just adds up all of the various reasons why this year turned out to be, very disappointing. So you had a government that really didn't put much money into consumers' pockets during the COVID lockdowns. The end of the COVID restrictions in China was very chaotic. There was a lot of confusion in the first part of this year about what government policy was going to be. There's a sense that probably there does need to be a little bit more government stimulus to get economic growth going, but the government, for whatever reason, doesn't want to do that. And this was combined with the fact that exports, which had boomed in the previous 2 years because of increased demand for electronics and all kinds of other stuff that China makes, had slowed down. So you had various kinds of miscellaneous domestic problems, some bad policy choices, and combining with, just by luck of timing, with a slowdown in exports. And so, and on top of this, you have the pressure on foreign companies to invest less in China because of US politics. And so all of these things sort of combine together to produce a disappointing outcome. And the recipe for solving this is basically the government just needs to step in and do more stimulus. And I think there are, frankly, a lot of people in China who would subscribe to some variant of this view, that this is not sort of a grand moment, secular turning point. This is just sort of a bad combination of factors, which requires more skillful macro management than we have seen so far. I guess my conclusion on this is that all of these different explanations do have a piece of the reality of what's going on. I wouldn't sort of dismiss any of them out of hand. It's clear that China for years has been building up significant systemic debt problems. That is true. It has been clear for decades that there is a very uncomfortable balancing act between the Communist Party's demand for complete political control and their attempt to create a dynamic, innovative economy. Those things don't naturally live together too comfortably. And it's also very clearly the case that you just have a number of individual factors that happen to combine this year for a bad outcome. But I don't think it's enough, and I think we can come up with a better way to describe what's going on in China. First step towards this is to understand where the problems in these various narratives lie. So if you look at the story that, China today is basically like Japan in 1990, superficially, there's a little bit of resemblance there in the sense that they were both high debt economies. They both had big property bubbles. And the resemblances break down pretty quickly after that. So this is one illustration of part of it, which is just the asset price bubble that you saw in Japan in the 1980s was many, many, many times larger than the asset price bubble that we've seen in China. So yes, there clearly are some issues with the Chinese property market that are quite serious and are going to take a while to resolve. But we are not seeing the kind of just extraordinary misvaluation of underlying assets that you saw in Japan. The other, I think, critical difference is that if you look at the total sort of the political economy of Japan then versus China today, it's quite different. And in Japan, not only did you have a big property bubble, but you had banks that owned the shares of companies that owned the shares of banks. So the balance sheets of corporate Japan and financial Japan were fundamentally intertwined, and everything was collateralized by land values, which went completely crazy in the late 1980s. And so what happened is that when that bubble popped and the asset values came down, the balance sheet of the entire country basically came down as one. And this is what Richard Koo described in his book about Japan in the 1990s. China, and I'll get back to this later, is a more fragmented system. And I think it's a little bit of an error to assume that debt in one part of the country necessarily has an impact on another part of the system that is in other ways largely unconnected from it. In fact, Chinese policymakers have been pretty careful to ensure that the kinds of cross-shareholding structures that exist in Japan were not permitted in China. So the corporate and the financial systems were different. And so I think that enables a very different kind of solution to the problem. First of all, it's a different problem, and it creates different solutions than was the case in Japan. If you look at corporate China, and I will admit, this is only the listed firms, so there's like a gigantic universe of non-listed firms out there. But if you look at listed firms, what's very striking is that they have been deleveraging their balance sheets basically for a decade, which is not as surprising if you've sort of been following Chinese policy for the entire time that Xi Jinping has been in office since 2013, and especially since late 2016. Financial risk and excessive leverage has been a big target of the regulators. And they've put a lot of pressure on companies in different sectors at different times to cut back on debt, with mixed success, but the trend is very clear. So it really is not the case that if you look at the listed universe, that Chinese corporations are burdened by unmanageable levels of debt. Now, if you get into unlisted state-owned enterprises, particularly at the local level, very different story. But the closer you get to the really dynamic, productive sectors of the economy, basically the less debt you see. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about how we talk about this. Oh, China has a lot of debt. It's not just one undifferentiated blob of debt. It's debt that exists in certain places, has certain specific, often quite large impacts. It has some clear macro spillovers, but it is not a comprehensive shroud hanging over all of economic activity. So that's the balance sheet recession story. Now, the story about, people in China have lost confidence in the government. There is some real truth to this. So my last trip to China was in April. I spent a month there. And the first quarter of this year actually was pretty good. But people were beginning to get an inkling that, the recovery was just not as robust as they had hoped. And I was at a couple of events where there were private sector people, and they were complaining that they just were not seeing very much consumer demand. They didn't feel that the economy was very vibrant, and so they were reluctant to invest. They were reluctant to hire new staff. There's also anyone who spends much time talking to private entrepreneurs in China will pick up that there is a lot of suspicion, hostility / hatred of the Communist Party, the government, a lot of fear that that Xi Jinping's obsession with control is just going to make their life a lot more difficult. So there's no question that anecdotally, that there are certain areas where sentiment in China has become significantly gloomier. And I think most people who have visited China in the last 2 months come back with some variant of the report that people are just not feeling very positive about things. So that's true. On the other hand, if you look at the data, what you see here is not, consumers have money, but they're not spending it because they're not confident. What you see here is, consumers don't have as much money as they used to have. Why? Well, because there was a pandemic, there were 2 phases of lockdowns in early 2020 and then in 2022. A lot of people lost income, they lost their jobs, lost their businesses, and the communist government did nothing for you. They said, oh, you lost your job, you lost your income. Great, you're on your own. Good luck. See you at the end of the pandemic, basically. And this is very strikingly different to the United States. Capitalist United States, non-socialist United States said, oh, we're shutting everything down because of the pandemic. Here, let's put a lot of money in your pocket twice, right? So those are the 2 spikes. What I'm showing here is nominal household income in aggregate relative to the previous pre-pandemic trend. That's what you see in both of these charts. Dotted lines are the pre-trends. The solid lines are the actual outcomes. And in the United States, you had not only these 2 big stimulus programs, but you can see that household incomes remained well above the previous trend long after the lockdowns had ended, because people came out into one of the tightest job markets in American history, and so were able to bid up wages. Now, a lot of this money got eaten up in inflation. In fact, real income has fell. But the reason that the US has felt dynamic over the last couple of years is because there has been this huge burst of nominal income growth that fed a lot of spending and a lot of inflation. And I think a lot of people outside of China, particularly in the US, assumed that China would do the same thing. And if it didn't, that proved that there was something deeply wrong with China. And I think you can basically argue that the only thing deeply wrong with China in this regard is that they did not support people's incomes during COVID. And so what you can see also here is that the red line consumption fell more sharply than the blue line and has failed to come up. And that does reflect a confidence issue. People see that they're losing income, that their friends are losing income. So they hunker down, they say, we're not going to spend, we're going to save because we don't know where this is going to end. So it's precautionary saving against a kind of a macroeconomic shock for which the government was not providing any particular support. Now, if you look at the most recent numbers in the right end of the chart, what you can see is the income line has been steadily rising and is now back almost to the pre-pandemic trend. And the consumption line has been rising faster, which means that the savings rate, household savings rate, has been going down. So the propensity to consume out of your income is rising. And that does not seem to me an indication that people have permanently lost confidence in the system. I think it argues exactly the opposite, that while all of the COVID uncertainties were going on, people were very, very conservative. And it has taken them a while to get out of that because the growth in incomes has been slow, but it is happening. So I have a less metaphysical view of this loss of confidence in the consumer sector. I think it is basically an artifact of income effects that are gradually getting stabilized. And I also think that the difference between the China picture and the US picture explains some of the extreme reaction that we've seen in the United States to what's happened in China, because the assumption was that China would be exactly like the US. It wasn't, therefore something is wrong with China. And I think what's wrong with China is simply a macroeconomic mistake, arguably, that they didn't put enough money in consumers' pockets during the pandemic. Finally, there's a story that, oh, private entrepreneurs don't want to invest. Well, we can certainly go to China. We can certainly talk to a lot of private entrepreneurs who are very gloomy and negative about things. But again, if you look at the data, total private sector fixed investment is the black line. And you can see the growth there is around 0. So that's not very good. However, a lot of private sector investment is in real estate because the majority of real estate developers are private. So the data enables us to disaggregate manufacturing from services, basically. Services includes real estate. And when you do that, you see that private sector investment in manufacturing is actually pretty robust. And in fact, growing stronger than it was in years prior to COVID. Now, I don't want to put a huge amount of weight on this because there are a lot of problems in the fixed asset investment data of a technical nature, which I don't want to go into, but it is very, very difficult to reconcile this data with the story that there's some kind of widespread malaise among private entrepreneurs. And you can certainly find many, many industries, particularly in these sort of tech-intensive sectors favored by the government, that seem to be doing fine. So again, a little bit of skepticism about the private entrepreneurs have given up on China. It's also interesting to me that the two big stories that came out of China this year, they were in simultaneously, is number one, China's economy is going off the rails, it's collapsing, the Leninist build is coming due, Xi Jinping has a failing model, it's all bad, bad, bad. Oh, China is also suddenly the world's biggest exporter of cars in the world. Bigger than Japan, bigger than Germany, bigger than South Korea. China is invading the world with electric vehicles that are not only cheap, but are higher quality and technologically more sophisticated than those of their European competitors. And this has all happened basically within the span of the last 2 or 3 years, as you can see here. So, and you can tell similar stories about China's position in clean energy industries and stuff like that. Is this really a situation where you have an economy that is, imploding or stagnating, and there's no dynamism or entrepreneurialism left in it? I am skeptical. I think it's more complicated than that. Okay, so having explained what I think is wrong with what everyone else thinks, I will put my cards on the table and suggest a better way of thinking about this, which incorporates, I think, a lot of the valid insights from these different critiques. Because as I said, I think all of these stories are getting at some things that are really there and we need to take seriously. Okay, so I think these are the sort of concepts that we want to keep in mind. First of all, the direction from the top, the policy settings at the very top of the system are different now than they have been at most points in the last 40 years of Chinese history. So the Communist Party's number one priority has always been to keep itself in power and to squash all alternatives. But for most of the last 40 years, the number two priority, which ran a very close second, was to maximize economic growth. And there was always like an interest in technology and stuff like that, but the leaders tended to be fairly agnostic about where the growth came from. Any kind of growth was good as long as you could be persuaded that they could keep doing it. And I think it's pretty clear that Xi Jinping just does not share this view. He does not view economic growth as an end in itself. And this is a real difference between him and all of his predecessors. If you do a word count of his speeches at the 5-year party congresses, you can see a steadily declining share of references to economic reform and a steadily rising share of references to security and technology, right? And I think that reveals what he's thinking about. So security, which is very broadly defined, self-sufficiency in technology, very important in part because the United States has decided that it wants to deny various kinds of technology to China permanently. So if you're a Chinese leader, you have to think about, okay, if we can't get it from the US, maybe we have to make it ourselves. Technological upgrading more generally, and social equity, making sure that the benefits of growth are spread more generally. And I think the ones to focus on for this discussion are really the security and the technology ones, and particularly technology. I think if you want to think of an index of success for Xi Jinping, it would be some index of China's technological capabilities, not its GDP. Because as long as China has the technology to advance, provide a good livelihood for most of its people and project its power internationally, I think he will be satisfied. And if lower growth rate comes along with that, he's not terribly fussed by it, right? So that's one point. I think, and I'll sort of, this will presage a thing I'll say at the end. I think he also is, the evidence is that she has a kind of a puritanical sort of view of things. One might almost call it Germanic in its economic manifestations. And, I tend to think that he thinks that austerity is good for people. And this is, I think, clearly filtered down into the way the macroeconomy is being managed. And I'll come back at the end to elaborate on that a little bit more. Okay, so that's point one. Top level direction is no longer go for economic growth. It's go for security and go for technological upgrading. Second, it is very clear that there is a top-down process of capital reallocation going on here, because Chinese economic leaders have recognized, I think for several years, that the economy was too reliant on infrastructure, too reliant on property. These drivers had exhausted themselves and they needed something new. And if you read Chinese sort of economic strategy documents, basically what they say is, we need to have a technologically advanced society. And so technological development and upgrading is going to drive productivity and economic growth. That is where the capital needs to go. It needs to stop going to property and infrastructure, and it needs to start going to these other sectors. And, you know, if you strip the sort of top-down political rhetoric out of this, I think most ordinary economists would say, yeah, that's a good idea, actually, because these are sort of high productivity industries. These other things, the old drivers, are exhausted. So yes, we should see a capital reallocation from one to the other. Now, I think where people have problems is a lot of economists would like to see that being done by the market. And here it's the state saying, we're going to move it from here to there. But I think it's important to recognize that, okay, yeah, this is a politically driven decision, but it's also an economically fairly rational decision. I think it has some clear limitations. If you try to run an entire economy totally on the basis of industrial policy, I think you're limiting your options, but it's not crazy. And then third, and I've alluded to this before, is that you have this debt problem, which I view as not as a threat of collapse or even as necessarily something that dooms China to a particular growth rate, but as a constraint on policy. So you do have very, very high levels of debt. A lot of this is concentrated in entities affiliated to local governments, state enterprises, and so forth. There's a complex of entities that are affected by this. And working out all of these debt program problems is going to be the work of several years. So they're going to be dealing with this throughout the 2020s. But as I said before, I think the debt problem is fragmented, and it is not necessarily the case that the large debt problems in the infrastructure and property complex will retard the ability of the more productive parts of the economy to keep moving ahead. Not necessarily. Could happen. Okay. So if you accept these premises that these are kind of the three factors lurking in the background, what does this mean for, you know, the economy, the stuff that we really care about? So I put two negatives and one positives here. So the negative is, I think this is what we're seeing now, and I think this is likely to be a theme of the next several years, is I don't think China's economy is collapsing. I don't think they've hit some inflection point where they're, you know, going into some kind of huge stagnation. But I do think that they have set themselves up for a chronic shortfall of aggregate demand, because in the most simple sense, you have an enormous amount of demand that was created in the economy by all this investment in property and infrastructure. And now you're saying we have to cut that by some gigantic amount. Right now, it's about 40%. And we're going to substitute for that by investing a lot more in semiconductors and robots and AI and green energy and so forth. And if you do the arithmetic on it, it is very clear that the loss from the property infrastructure complex is much larger than the gain that you can reasonably expect to get from those industries. So you just have created a hole in aggregate demand on the investment side that you can't really fill in the way that you've said that you're going to fill it. Well, now there are other ways that you could fill it. You could say, okay, well, we can keep leveraging up, and they've said, no, can't do that. We have to keep a tight line on debt, and we have to force people to deleverage. And in fact, that's why we have a property problem in China today. It's because the government 3 years ago said there's too much debt in property, it's overextended. We have to force a deleveraging, even if it's very painful. So this is why I say it's a constraint on policy. is that it is very, very difficult when you have a cyclical downturn for the government to step in and say, oh, let's just loosen monetary policy for a little while and pump a bunch of money into the economy and get things going, and then we'll draw back later. They're very reluctant to do that. Third, you could say, well, okay, what about the consumer? People have been talking about rebalancing towards consumption for years. Why don't you set things up so that the consumer can be more of a driver of economic activity in China? And the answer is that basically the economic elite policymakers in China do not believe on that in principle. I don't think they have ever believed that rebalancing and making China more like a US-style consumer demand-driven economy is the correct thing to do. I think their model of how economies work is there is investment. If the investments are in the right high productivity things, this will create, all of this industrial capacity. This will create a lot of good jobs, high-paying jobs, service jobs downstream from that. And so you'll get consumption as a byproduct of correct investment decisions. And this is fundamentally a sort of mercantilist way of thinking about it, that economies are about production, it's not about consumption. And it leads ultimately to, an investment-heavy growth model, persistent trade surpluses, because you are always producing more than you're consuming. The consumption is a lag to production. And so you've always got a surplus of investment over consumption, which gives you a trade surplus. And I think this is just deeply embedded. This isn't just something that Xi Jinping or his colleagues came up with. I think this is deeply embedded for a long time in Chinese policy. And if they had any doubts about that, they were ended in 2008 with the global financial crisis, which I think they took the lesson from that the American model was not something that they wanted to pursue. And what they're more interested in doing is looking like Germany. I'll come back to that. So I think if you want to come up with analogs to the sort of specific economic problems that we're seeing today in China, I think Japan in the 1990s is maybe not the best. There's no perfect analog. One is actually the United States 10 years ago, and for most of the 2010s. You remember secular stagnation? This was a big thing. The US, it was just like dead, right? Because all of these forces had combined to make it impossible for productivity growth to come back. You had all kinds of people like Robert Gordon arguing that, you'd had this productivity boom years ago, which is not replicated in the internet age, and so forth. And I think you can make a very strong case retrospectively that the problem in the 2010s in the United States was not secular stagnation. It was the fact that we didn't do enough to stimulate the economy after the financial shock of 2008, 2009, that we should have done a double or triple fiscal stimulus. We just had a problem of shortfall of aggregate demand because essentially an austerity mindset had taken over and captured the political system and made it impossible for anyone to seriously argue about just pumping a lot of money into the economy and seeing what happened. So I think there are very strong echoes of the kind of US policy, economic policy discourse of a decade ago in China today. You could also look at Germany in the 1990s after it reunified, very major shock, a government that was really resistant to any kind of stimulating reforms, a lot of efforts to restructure the labor arrangements and so forth, and to focus on essentially the efficiency of investment at the expense of everything else. So not perfect analogs, but I think you can draw at least as convincing parallels between those episodes at China today as with Japan. Okay, so that's, I think, a feature of China that we're going to be living with for a while. Second, and this is deeper, Yasheng Huang down at MIT wrote a book 15 years ago called Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. And in this, he came up with a really useful concept called directional liberalism. And the problem he was trying to solve was why was it that entrepreneurs in China in 1980s and 1990s who had no real property rights, no, assurance that their investments wouldn't be confiscated by the state, how come they were so willing to invest and be entrepreneurial despite these problems? And basically his answer was they saw that Deng Xiaoping and various other people at the top of the system were saying, this is the broad direction for China. Over the long haul, we're going to get more open, we're going to get more dynamic, there's going to be more markets, and yes, there'll be cycles along the way, but the direction is clear. And they bet on that direction. And I think that's a very powerful and useful insight for understanding the way that China developed, from the early 80s into the 2000s. And so I basically believe that. I think the problem is if you believe that, you now have to agree that we are no longer in an era of directional liberalism. We are in an era of directional something else, not liberalism, a direction towards more centralized one party and one person rule, more control over every aspect of society, something that is decidedly not liberal. And I think this sense of that there's just been a clear sense of overall direction in China. It's complicated, but I think it's basically true. I think this explains why, lots of people who made their money in the early era are now feeling very dispirited. And I think it also explains a lot of the commentary outside China that says, well, you've changed this direction and this new direction cannot possibly work. I think if you look at the available evidence, it's not clear to me that this change in direction has yet really permanently damaged the dynamism and innovation of the Chinese economy, but you can easily imagine how it could, right? So that is, I think, to me, a more useful way, maybe of framing the opposing argument that we really have moved into a new era. But that's not something that happened this month, this year. That's something that's been growing over Xi's tenure. And it could change if Xi has a heart attack. Okay, third consequence is, I think it's clear from all of this that we are likely to get slower growth. But slower growth can coexist with a lot of technological success. So China's economy has a terrible year, yet they become the world's biggest exporter of vehicles and world leader in electric vehicles. I think we have to be respectful of the fact that the manufacturing ecosystem that has grown up in China over the last 30 years is extremely powerful. There's a lot of embedded knowledge. There are a lot of networks, supplier networks. They cannot they're not going to go up in smoke. And they can't be moved anywhere else or replicated anywhere else with very much ease. Once you have a big industrial manufacturing base like this, it is very difficult to dismantle. It has a lot of momentum. And I think you can point to a lot of individual sectors where there's also significant innovation within these manufacturing industries currently. And I think this is important because when we talk about the problem of, security and a sort of more Orwellian security state, surveillance, and this loss of direction liberalism, that is really, really bad if you are Jack Ma running an e-commerce and fintech company. It is really, really bad if you are Pony Ma and you are running a social media platform. It is very, very bad for people in sort of these highly visible internet service platform industries, which basically rely on social mobilization and the accumulation of huge amounts of personal data. Why? Because they are a potential political threat to the regime. These types of concerns do not apply, I think, so much if you are making electric vehicles or batteries or looking at the next cancer drug or all kinds of things. And I think there's been a lot of work to suggest that in these sort of less visible, more sometimes described as hardware sectors, the sort of concerns about the bad direction of China politically and socially are much less. And it's much less of a detriment to their innovative capacity. I think over the very long run, it's kind of hard to see a really innovative economy thriving in a political system that is becoming as dark and as controlled as China seems to be becoming. But I think that could be a very long transition before all of the elements of dynamism are wrung out of the system. Okay, so a few concluding remarks to try and add it all up. So where do I think China is headed? So first of all, I think a lot of the China slowdown rhetoric is kind of like, yeah, of course, China's getting richer. As countries get richer, they slow down. So here we've plotted China's growth rate, per capita GDP growth rate, against its level of income. So as you go from left to right on the chart, you get richer. And we've plotted it against the other big East Asian economies with whom China shares many features. And what is noticeable is that China is pretty much doing the same thing that Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Singapore did in their heyday. It is not an outlier. It does not seem to be moving out of this pattern in any dramatic way. This is a smoothed figure. If you look, I do have a chart that shows the unsmoothed figure. So for 2020, China is down here at 2%. Then the next year was up at 8%. And this year it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. So it's very volatile because of COVID. But if you look at the trend, it's not clear that they're falling off the cliff. So I think part of what's going on is that China is just naturally hitting a period of significantly slower growth. I think it's unreasonable to expect them to keep growing as fast as Korea and Taiwan did at a similar stage, because Korea and Taiwan are much smaller. Their export economies could be a huge part of the total economic picture. They could rely a lot on external demand. China's just too big for that. Can't do that. The other interesting thing is, if you look at Japan, which is the low man on the totem pole in this chart, you can see, yeah, that after reaching China's current level of income, Japan only grew by like 3.5% for the next decade. That decade was not the 1990s, it was the 1980s, when most people thought Japan was this ultra dynamic economy that was going to take over the world tomorrow, right? So the point here is simply to say that we need to be a little bit careful about saying, okay, China is now going to grow at some more normal rate than we're used to, a lot lower. It may not even grow fast enough to ever catch up with the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is an economy without dynamism and without a lot going on. And I think that's failing to sort of put those two things together is a flaw in some of the negativity that we see now. If you look at China's technological gains, very difficult to measure because there's no single index. But one thing I look at is just China's share of global manufactured exports. And the hypothesis here is very simple. If you're going to be competitive in exporting manufactured goods to the rest of the world, you cannot do this on a long-term basis purely by being the cheapest game in town. That leads nowhere. If you are going to be really successful, you have to keep upgrading your technology. So an increase or a maintenance of a high level of global manufactured goods export share, to me, is prima facie evidence of strong technological foundations. And if you look at the red line here, that is China's share of global manufactured exports. It's obviously gone up quite a lot. It's now sitting around 20%. There's some uncertainty about what the exact trend is right now. There are different ways that you can measure. But broadly speaking, China is a very, very competitive across a very wide spectrum of goods in global export markets. And this competitiveness does not come from a cheap currency or just cost advantages, because China's labor actually is not all that cheap by global standards anymore. It clearly comes from technological advantages as well. And if you look at the absolute numbers, the blue bars, you can see that there was just a gigantic increase in Chinese exports the last couple of years. The other key thing is, it used to be most of China's exports were produced by foreign companies operating on Chinese soil. And so you can say, well, there's kind of this enclave economy multinationals and their suppliers like Foxconn are using China as a platform, but this really isn't reflective of indigenous technological advantages in China. It's just reflective of the fact that they have a huge labor force and pretty good infrastructure. But this is no longer true. So if you look at the foreign invested enterprise share of Chinese exports, as recently as a decade ago, it was over 50%. It is now down to 30%. I mean, 70% of this rapidly rising volume of Chinese exports is coming from domestic firms, largely private or private-ish. Meg and I can have a debate about whether there are any private companies left in China today. Entrepreneurial. So again, what this suggests is that we're not just seeing China as like a vessel for other people to do their stuff in. China is actually becoming more technologically competent. So slower growth, but significant areas of technological excellence. Where I would conclude on China is, as I've been hinting all along, I think Xi Jinping's vision for China is one of what I would call a Leninist Germany. The idea is we want to be an investment-led, technologically developed country with huge trade surplus, self-sufficient in everything, low debt rates, virtuous in that sense. That's what we want. And I'm not so concerned. Germany doesn't have the highest GDP growth rate in the world, but it is a better economy and more socially stable than a place like the United States, which is a higher growth rate, but all of these horrible social problems that we in China do not want to emulate. So my intuition is that that's kind of what he's pushing for. You can see a lot of Chinese documents that indicate that there's a desire to keep the level of manufacturing as a share of GDP high and not deindustrialize in the same way that the United States has. So a German or a Korean type of model is what I think most likely growth rate for China over the rest of this decade is somewhere in the 3 to 3.5% range, so a lot lower than we've seen in the past, lower than we have now. And I think Xi will accept this as long as he sees the technology growing the way that he needs to. So I think, you can put some positive spins on this. One is if China grows at 3% over the next 7 years and India grows by 6%, the amount of incremental demand created by China over that period will be double that in India. So the base in China is so high, slower growth, still have a lot more absolute growth. So the volume effects, I think, are really important. Another thing I think that is worth bearing in mind when we look at the China-Japan comparison is, looking back, I think you can say that one of the reasons that Japan really went off the rails as much as it did in the 1990s in terms of going from being a leader in the global economy to a pretty distant follower was that it missed the single biggest shift in the global economy in the 1990s, which was the shift to the internet. It became sort of this island. It cut itself off from the internet as a whole, never really mastered the whole networking thing. And that had huge implications, for example, their semiconductor industry and various other things. China, arguably, it has cut itself off from the global internet, but it has a pretty gigantic internet of its own, so it's probably okay there. But the bigger issue is that China has not cut itself off from what appears to be the major shift of this coming era, which is the green energy transition. In fact, it's a leader in that era. So again, I think there's a question about, is China missing the point of what's going on in the world, or are they actually doing a pretty good job of anticipating new changes? You can argue that they're doing a good job. I think the biggest question, though, is I think this problem of increased authoritarianism, surveillance, decreased personal freedom. Most of the literature on innovation suggests that it thrives when you have maximum connections between different unrelated fields. And a lot of innovation comes from just people making unexpected connections that you cannot predict in advance. And if you have a highly controlled political system, these become much, much more difficult to achieve. So over the long run, I think there is considerable risk. This system that I've outlined here leads to a situation where, yeah, China is very good at this or that technological thing, but this is not a dynamic ecosystem. These are sort of an isolated archipelago of technological success stories set in a very, very calm, motionless, non-growing sea around them. That is a real risk. And so that's why I say that she has this vision, but there is a risk, not today, but over a period of time, that you create the stagnation in China because of the political controls. I think I will stop there. I have a couple more things to say about what this means in terms of sort of external influence by the Belt and Road. I also had a little bit of material on the interactions with the US, but I think probably I've given you enough to think about and talk about for now, and we can pick up some of those themes maybe in the discussion. So at this point, I believe, Meg, you are going to be the mocker of the microphone.
First week.
Oh.
I will call on people, but let me take my prerogative. First, say I do believe there are private firms in China, but also to ask a couple of questions, and I'll try and make them quick. So the first is, you said almost nothing until the final slide about external influence, and you meant China's influence in the rest of the world. So it's interesting, you know, reading the basic, you know, reading the basic statements. The Chinese officials are clearly saying it's a hard rebalancing for our economy, which is exactly what you're saying, and the external environment is bad. Yeah. So what is the effect of the external environment? Have U.S. restrictions had any impact? And then, you know, this may be a question to think about later, because I realize you're an economist and not a political scientist, but this is, of course, your fault, and I have to still ask you this, which is the thing that makes Germany stable, right, is its large social welfare net.
Yes.
So if China's economy has high-tech manufacturing in green energy sectors or in new, you know, high-tech manufacturing sectors, that's not going to employ or enrich the wide swath of, in particular, the urban middle class in China, the way that the last growth model has. Yeah. So is it politically stable to see such a transition in China?
Okay, well, I actually never took an economics course, so I can't claim to be an economist. I usually present myself as a political economist, so I will
because there's no course
address the second question with great enthusiasm. But on the first one, no question that there's a lot of concern in China about basically the breakdown in relations with the United States, the fact that, you know, you had this trade war with Trump. I think there had been some hope that when Biden came in, there would be some modulation of that, and there was none, basically. And in fact, a much more disciplined and effective approach to cutting off key technologies. And I think they were extremely unhappy about that. And that's what lies behind this sort of defensive hunkering down. We have to provide for our own security and self-sufficiency because it is a hostile environment. So when they talk about the hostile environment, I think they're mainly talking about the US. And I think there's a question there, right? And so I think the next shoe to fall here, so we clearly have seen, you know, some trade effects, you know, some loss of access to technology. But the thing that has been very noticeable in the last few months, and I didn't include it here for various reasons, one of which is hard to know what the trend is. Foreign direct investment way down, and venture capital investment way down, right? And I don't think we know enough for sure how permanent these drops are, but it sure feels like whatever the amount of FDI and VC money was coming into China over the last 10 or 15 years, what comes in the next 10 or 15 years is going to be substantially less than that. I think that is almost certainly true. And the question is, how much does that matter? And I honestly don't know, right? I think there's a tendency in the West to say, oh, this is really important. The Chinese would never be able to succeed unless it was our wonderful, you know, insights and capital that helped them along. And I think that's a little bit, you know, grandiose. But it's clearly the case that FDI and VC capital had major catalytic effects. And we just don't know. What is China mature enough now that they don't really need that stuff? They can generate the capital on their own. The markets are sufficiently functional that they can substitute for that. or is there some secret sauce that is really going to be lost? And that is, I think, a real risk. And that I think that's way more important than the controls on semiconductors, et cetera, which are in fact very narrowly targeted and are bad for the individual industries targeted, but macroeconomically are really not that important. Okay, so that would be my answer in the first one. On the second one, yeah, I guess there's a difference between, I was simply describing what I think is the theory of the Chinese leadership, not saying, and that is a correct and analytically perfect theory. I think you are absolutely right to point out there are a lot of elements of the German social contract that are not simply covered by industrial policy. I will say, if you look at the social safety net in China, it is pretty threadbare by Western standards, but it's a lot better than what they had 10 or 15 years ago. You can go to pretty much any remote countryside village. There will be some kind of healthcare facility. Everyone has some kind of a pension at this point, not very much. And I think the philosophy there has been that they want to create wide coverage for social welfare, make sure that everyone has something, but keep the level very low because they've seen the problems that advanced countries have gotten into by overpromising on welfare and leading to unsustainable fiscal situations. So I think there's a logic to that, and it is a cogent logic, and it is a logic which I think consciously addresses the question of what do we need to do to make China stable. We think this is okay. And I think they're probably right about that. I think the deeper question is, as you pointed out, are they going to be able to generate enough high quality employment? Fortunately, the working age population is now shrinking very rapidly. So this is a slightly less urgent problem than it was before, but you still have a lot of people to deal with. And indeed, that is a potential pitfall of this strategy.
Thanks. All right, so if you have questions, raise your hand. Okay, so Dinda will come over here first. And just introduce yourself briefly.
Is that mic working?
Yeah, it's a little hard to hear. Closer.
Why not shell on the acts instead of just why not connect? So that's considering. Secondly, you kind of frame the transition in China, both transition.
Yeah, just finish the question, Alex. The hesitance behind that to be more of an institutionalized belief in Beijing that a heavy top-down, heavy investment, heavy strategy works better than
Yes. Okay.
What do you see the argument?
Yeah. So the basic question is, why hasn't the government done more to stimulate the economy in various means than it has done? And I think the answer, I mean, as Meg alluded to, certainly the official answer from the government is we are going through a necessary transition. And so we shouldn't be propping up, if we stimulated, we would essentially be propping up the old sectors that need to shrink. So that is not in long-term interest. We need to just suck it up and accept the pain and undergo this structural transformation that will lead us to a better place. That's the official view. There's certainly a lot of debate on this. In fact, you probably saw there was a headline today about Yi Gang, former head of the central bank, saying, you know what, we're not stimulating enough. We need to pump more money in the economy. So there are plenty of people in the Chinese system who believe that this is just a mistake and that you don't have to be so, excuse my language, hard-assed about austerity. You can achieve the structural transformation, but still do more to support growth. But that clearly is not what's being done now. And I think the other potential explanation is that messaging from the top has been a little bit unclear. And this is a complaint that you get a lot in China, that, and this was very much the case during COVID and in the exit from COVID, that people don't want to do things because they're not sure what the top guy wants, and they would rather do nothing than make a mistake. So I think we don't know for sure how much of the current policy mix is a completely deliberate, carefully thought out strategy, and how much is just like an artifact of bureaucrats making sort of opportunistic decisions and not moving because they think it might get them into trouble, and the top guy not giving a sort of a clear sense of what he wants, right? I think both of those interpretations are out there. But I tend to believe that there's like, and again, I remember 10 years ago, we just like had a political consensus in 2010, 2012 that, oh, you couldn't stimulate, it would be terrible, moral hazard, all kinds of horrible inflationary, terrible things would happen if you pump more money into the economy. And the price that we paid in the United States for that was 10 years of below potential growth and kind of a political revolution when people got unhappy with that. So it's not just in China that you can sort of get people committed to a sort of a moral, virtuous path of economic pain as the route to gain. So I think there's probably some analogs there just in terms of the political debate within China, some analogs of that to what we went through here 10 years ago.
All right, maybe we'll do two at a time this time,
yes.
Just to see. Do you have your question up? Oh, well, you have the mic.
I got the mic.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is kind of a follow-up to what you're talking about now, which is it's really about the sort of psychological and political aspects of what we're seeing unfold. And, you know, for the past many decades, we've all thought of there being a kind of a social contract, yep. Which was, you know, tremendous economic growth, and your incomes will increase dramatically, all that kind of stuff. Don't play politics, you know, we'll have control over that side of things. And that was pretty much okay to people. So the question is, if you don't have that kind of economic growth going forward, but you have increasing, you know, tightening in the political area, is that, you know, sustainable? What will happen?
Yep, good. So do you want to take the second one?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. And then the second question here.
So it seems nice solution for this, and also the no longer developing the real estate suggests that we will be having, if not loss, but at least no continuing in growth in the welfare of the most family, which is predominantly real estate. And if majority of the people no longer have the benefits of economic growth, but it looks like your presentation shows to be clear, which is going to be the oldest manufacturing capitalism, the capitalists that will enjoy most of the benefits.
Right. Yes. Right.
So in that sense, why do you still promote in China the policy to be relaxed for financial markets to be continuing to grow? Is that a possible way to shield or harbor this wealth that people want to grow? Or
so wait, are you asserting that there is a policy for growth of the financial markets, and you're asking why that policy exists? Or
yes, that's like fire.
Right.
That's growth in the financial markets.
Yeah. Will
be the next phase when the real estate market or the other that's traditionally people that's their funding wealth of.
Yep. Okay, good. All right. So on the social contract, but you can create new social contracts, I think. And I think that's what these various invocations of the China dream and so forth are about, is to try and steer people towards a more traditional understanding of, the virtuous life and the correct relationship between the rulers and the ruled, right? So I think there is a fairly extensive propaganda effort going on to shift away from that old social contract precisely so you don't get nailed when people say, well, why is my income not growing at 10 or 15% a year? And I think, the anti-corruption campaign fits into this. My observation is that this is very popular with most people. There was a sense that, everyone's votes were rising, but some people's votes were rising a lot faster than everyone else's. And it's good that some of those people got in jail. So I think there are a lot of legitimacy strategies that the government can apply even in the context of lower growth if they make sure that enough of various kinds of benefits are spread around sufficiently equally, and that you have some growth so that people do have a sense that there is forward motion, even if it's less than the past. On the second question, that's an interesting one, because there was a lot of work done 15, 20 years ago to show that as China industrialized, basically the income share of capital rose and the income share of labor fell. So if you have an industrial policy driven growth model, that could imply that you are sort of setting up a situation where maintaining sort of the income of laborers is going to be a problem. I think the way the government would see this, first of all, is that the real monopoly problems were in the internet sector, which are, in fact, the network effect's very powerful. You do have monopoly power. And so if you had an economy focused around these internet platform companies, a few people would get really, really rich and everyone else would be like a delivery guy. And I think their view is that by cracking down on that and trying to redirect things towards, more hard technologies, if you will, that actually is intrinsically more equitable. It's a good question. I think financially, it's just like they understand that they don't have a financial system that really fully satisfies all the needs of a modern economy. So they need to keep developing it. That's why they keep giving licenses to foreign asset managers to come in and so forth. I think that is an area where they feel like there's just a set of technologies that needs to be improved. But I think that's kind of a distinct effort from, it's in a separate bucket conceptually from the whole industrial policy sort of tendency of policy.
So Bill is behind you.
Bill Shell, I'm a retired professor of economics, but I specialize in health economics, but I'm not a threat to you. My question is this. Before all this recent change, economists talk about China going to have time to move to the next phase of growth with the middle income trap.
Yep.
And with the financial market needs major reform in China and have to change the saving habits and investment of the people. Meanwhile, you're giving a projection, even on the low end, it's 3 to 3.5% growth. Can you explain how do you derive that number as a trend in light of the problem we already know China faced, to move from one stage of economic to another stage?
Okay.
We'll take one more if there's another hand up down here in the front.
Yes.
I see. Thank you. Sure. I'm just working for it over here.
So my name is Alex. I was born in China, but I lived in Los Angeles.
Can you hold the mic?
Yep. And right now I'm doing a PhD in education here. And so just 3 hours ago, People's Daily published an article essentially saying we need a stronger state-owned enterprise sector. And I think they shifted the value proposition a little bit. Like now they could invest in longer-term industry than other companies, private companies don't want to. It's slower, it's longer, and it's hard technology.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to work out long-term in terms of both within the economy and bringing the private company into those industries?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the first question, I think you probably exaggerate the depth of our econometric precision at GAVCAL Dragonomics. So the number that I'm throwing out there is a very kind of impressionistic, this is where I think they could potentially go. And it's not based on a sort of a systematic growth accounting exercise. But it's based on, first of all, the precedents that if you look at Japan, Korea, Taiwan, which shared a lot of features with China's economy, this is what they were able to do. So that, to me, kind of sets the bounds of what could be plausible. It's not a guarantee that you will do it. So that's point one. Point two, I think I've spent like over 30 years of my life looking at this, and one of the constant features is that outside observers, I think, have quite consistently underestimated the resilience, dynamism, and adaptability of the Chinese economy, and in fact, the governance system, right? And so long before people were talking about the middle income trap, they were talking about, various other terrible things that would happen in China, from financial collapse to, in the early 2000s, there was a theme of Latin Americanization of China because of rising inequality and so forth. And every time that one of these challenges has risen, things have emerged to deal with it. So I've grown to have a lot of respect for the adaptability of the system. And I guess the other sort of key component of my analysis here is that when I look at the micro level, at what they have been able to achieve in a wide swath of manufacturing sectors, it's extremely impressive, right? And the entrepreneurial ecosystem that exists there is very, very robust. So it really boils down to a question of, are the policymakers smart enough to give that thing enough space to grow? If so, then there is literally no problem, right? The problem in China, as I'm sure you know, is that there's always a tendency at the center to try and control things more than necessary. And given that Xi Jinping is a control freak and he's now in office for life, and we know that for dictators, the quality of decision-making just degrades over time, yeah, there is no doubt a risk that that the life of the economy could be squeezed out gradually over time. The reason that I am not sort of jumping to that conclusion as the base case now is that Xi Jinping has a lot of goals relating to the wealth and power of the Chinese state. He wants China to be a great power. He wants it to be internationally influential. And he's not going to be able to get those things unless there is some degree of vitality in the economy. So I think at some level, he is still, to some degree, a economic rationalist who is not going to tip over into a situation where the political system just makes economic growth impossible. But you're kind of making a bet on one guy's psychology there, and it does not make me feel very comfortable. And on the question of SOEs, well, I haven't seen that particular report. This has obviously been a theme for a long time, that there's a lot of interest in increasing the role of the state-owned enterprises. One of my colleagues did an analysis recently, a couple of years ago, actually looked at the state-owned enterprise share of Chinese economy over a very long period of time, basically from 1995 to 2018 or so, and it was basically static at around 30%. Did not go up, it did not go down, the composition changed. And the conclusion that we came to from that exercise was that there's a revealed preference in the Chinese Communist Party to have a significant state role in the economy, but it does not have to be an absolute majority share of the economy. And I think as long as that is the case, you can have the state-owned enterprises coexisting with the entrepreneurial sector, and it kind of works fine. I think the question is whether these kinds of policy directives ultimately lead to more and more predatory behavior, where more and more private enterprises get, one way or another, sucked into the state system or become vassals of state-owned enterprises. I think we've seen some elements of that happening. I'm not particularly concerned about an individual policy announcement because those come all the time. And there are always people who have to say, yes, yes, we are in favor of the state-owned enterprise sector. What I'm more interested in is what the actual organizational dynamics are. And it's still, at the moment, it still seems like there's a pretty significant space for the entrepreneurial side of the economy to do its thing. But again, subject to all of the risks of what happens if you have an over-controlling central presence in power for too long.